Welcome to a deep dive, into a chapter of history that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
A chapter that reveals so much about the complex relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines, the Philippine-American War.
Yeah.
We're going to be exploring insights from an episode of the American History Tellers podcast,
Okay.
specifically their interview with Professor Vicente Raphael, a historian who specializes in Filipino history.
Right.
Together, let's uncover not just the events themselves,
Right.
but also the lasting impact of this war on both Filipino and American identities and how it connects to the bigger picture of global events.
It's fascinating how even the names Philippines and Filipino
Right.
are woven into this story of power and identity.
That's right. The very words we use are a starting point for understanding the layers of history here. You wouldn't think the name of a country could be so loaded,
Right.
but in this case, it really is.
The term Philippines originates from Filipinas, a name given by the Spanish colonizers in the 1500s
Right.
to honor King Philip II.
Right.
Initially, this name only applied to a small portion of the islands. But as Spanish control expanded, so did the reach of the name.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
The word Filipino originally referred only to Spaniards born in the Philippines.
Exactly.
It wasn't until the 19th century that Filipinos themselves reclaimed the term,
Right.
transforming it into a symbol of their own national identity and resistance against Spanish rule.
Exactly. It's almost as if they took back a piece of their own story,
Right.
using the colonizers' language to forge a new sense of self.
Yeah.
This struggle for independence played out in stages,
Right.
with the Philippine-American War acting as the third act in a long and complex drama.
So to understand the Philippine-American War,
Yeah.
we really need to rewind and look at the first two acts. Act 1, Filipinos launched their revolution against Spain in 1896.
Okay.
Act 2, the U.S. enters the scene, complicating an already volatile situation. It's important to remember that for Filipinos,
Right.
the U.S. arrival wasn't the start of their fight for freedom.
Yeah.
It was a continuation of a struggle that was already in motion.
Precisely.
The arrival of the U.S. simply introduced a new adversary into an existing conflict.
Right.
To grasp the full context, we need to go back even further
Yeah.
to the origins of Spanish influence in the Philippines.
Back to 1565.
Okay.
When the Spanish established their first permanent settlement in the Visayas,
Right.
then boom, in 1571,
Right.
Manila becomes the colonial capital,
Right.
a pivotal moment that would shape the next 3 centuries.
Over 300 years of Spanish rule.
Right.
But it's crucial to note that their control was never absolute. Think of it this way.
Okay.
Unlike their colonization of South America,
Right.
where they established vast settlements, their presence in the Philippines was always more tenuous,
Yeah.
more spread out. This meant that resistance to Spanish rule was a constant undercurrent throughout those 300 years.
Yeah. And that sets the stage for the
Right.
revolution to ignite later on.
You can't understand the fight for independence
Yeah.
without understanding that Filipinos never truly accepted Spanish rule. There was always that spark of resistance waiting for the right moment to flare up.
And that's where our next point comes in.
Right.
How did we get from localized resistance to a nationwide revolution?
Right.
This is where the global context becomes crucial.
Okay.
We're talking about the late 18th and 19th centuries, a time when revolutions were sweeping across the globe.
Right.
The American Revolution, the French revolutions in South America,
Yeah.
ideas of liberty and self-determination were spreading like wildfire.
It's like a ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
These ideas traveled across oceans,
Yeah.
inspiring people who were yearning for their own freedom.
Absolutely.
Filipinos weren't immune to these global currents of change.
Right.
They began to see themselves not just as subjects under a king, but as potential citizens with rights.
Absolutely. And this shift in thinking was fueled by a surprising source.
Okay,
Filipino priests within the Catholic Church.
that's right. We don't often think about internal church conflicts as catalysts for revolution,
Right.
but in this case, it was a key factor.
These priests were demanding equal treatment within the church hierarchy,
Right.
challenging the racism and discrimination they faced from the Spanish clergy. Their fight for equality within the church became a powerful inspiration
Right.
for the broader movement for independence.
It's amazing how seemingly separate issues
Yeah.
can intertwine and fuel social movements. This internal struggle for equality within the church
Right.
ended up feeding into a much larger fight for freedom and national identity. Now let's fast forward to 1898.
Okay.
The U.S. defeats Spain, and suddenly they're grappling with what to do with the Philippines.
Enter President McKinley and his policy of benevolent assimilation.
Right.
A phrase that, on the surface, sounds well-intentioned.
Right.
But when you dig deeper, reveals a whole lot of contradictions.
It's almost like they were trying to sugarcoat imperialism. But the reality is that expansionist ambitions were deeply ingrained in American history.
Yeah.
Even the American colonies' westward expansion
Right.
into Native American lands played a role in their push for independence from Britain.
This brings us to a striking anecdote about McKinley.
Okay.
Picture this. He's pointing to a map of the Philippines,
Okay.
and he says, "We're going to Christianize them."
Wow.
Now, this statement might seem utterly baffling, considering the Philippines was already predominantly Catholic.
Right.
But it actually reveals a Protestant worldview that saw Catholicism as a lesser form of Christianity.
Right.
Something to be fixed.
It's a perfect example of how religion can be used to justify political actions. Even when those actions are, let's be honest, pretty self-serving.
Right.
And it also ties into a larger historical narrative known as the Black Legend, which painted Spain as uniquely cruel and backward.
This narrative allowed the U.S. to position itself as a liberator, rescuing Filipinos from supposed slavery under Spain,
Right.
conveniently masking their own imperial ambitions.
Right.
And it's important to remember, some Americans genuinely believed this narrative. They saw the Philippine-American War as an extension of the abolitionist movement.
Right.
Another fight for freedom, even if it was deeply misguided.
Talk about a twisted interpretation of events.
Right.
But this manipulation of historical narratives becomes even more apparent when we look at the U.S. approach to language in the Philippines. They didn't just see English as a means of communication.
Right, right.
They saw it as a powerful tool for control and pacification.
It's a stark contrast to Spain's attitude.
Yeah.
You see, the Spanish actively resisted widespread teaching of Spanish, fearing it would empower Filipinos. The U.S., on the other hand, had a completely different strategy.
They went all in on spreading English, starting with soldiers teaching it in towns they had just liberated.
Right.
Then came the Thomasites, American teachers, who arrived by the boatload, literally on the USS Thomas, to disseminate the English language throughout the islands.
And you know what? It worked.
Yeah.
English fluency varied across different social classes,
Right.
but it undeniably became a dominant language in the Philippines,
Yeah.
a linguistic legacy that shapes the country to this day.
So we've got this complex history, a war that's often overlooked, and the U.S. pushing English as a tool of control.
Yeah.
This leads us to a crucial question.
Right.
How was this history taught, or rather not taught, in the Philippines?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the complicated dynamics of power, memory, and education.
Right.
The U.S. fostered a system they called colonial democracy,
Right.
allowing Filipinos to participate in government and maintain a relatively free press. But this system also served to co-opt Filipino elites, who became invested in maintaining the U.S.-backed status quo.
So even though the Philippines was on a path toward eventual independence, there were powerful Filipinos who had a vested interest in U.S. rule.
Exactly. They saw the U.S. as a source of stability, especially against potential unrest at home and rising threats from countries like Japan. And speaking of Japan, it was actually the Japanese who inadvertently revived interest in the Philippine-American War.
So I'm curious.
During World War II, Japan used the memory of the war as propaganda against the U.S.
Wow.
They reminded Filipinos of their past struggle against American colonization, hoping to turn them against their former colonizer.
Wow.
It's quite ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
The colonizer's enemy reminding Filipinos of their fight for freedom.
That's quite the twist.
Yeah.
It really highlights how history can be used and manipulated.
Right.
For political purposes, it also shows how historical memory is constantly being reshaped.
Yeah.
Depending on the political climate.
Absolutely.
And this point about historical memory is also evident in Professor Raphael's own experience. He grew up in the Philippines during the 1970s, a time when nationalism was resurging. And that's when he truly learned about the Philippine-American War. It's fascinating how personal experiences intersect with broader historical currents. And speaking of connections, are you ready to cross the Pacific?
Yeah.
And explore how all of this history laid the groundwork for Filipino migration to the U.S.?
Let's dive into that often overlooked chapter of the story.
So we're talking about Filipinos coming to America. And I think a lot of people might assume this migration started later, maybe mid-20th century. But the roots actually go back much further, right?
That's right. The story of Filipinos in America begins much earlier than many people realize. It actually starts during the Philippine-American War itself.
Wow.
The U.S. military utilized Filipino soldiers known as the Philippine Scouts to help suppress resistance.
It's a tactic we've seen used by many colonial powers, turning the colonized population against itself.
Right.
It's a divide and conquer strategy
Yeah.
that creates a complicated dynamic within the colonized society.
Exactly. And this early involvement of Filipinos in the U.S. military set a precedent.
Right.
As early as 1901, the U.S. Navy began actively recruiting Filipinos, often for menial roles below deck.
What a stark contrast to the promises of equality and opportunity under benevolent assimilation. It seems the reality for many Filipinos who sought a better life in America was far from the rosy picture painted by the U.S. government.
Absolutely. And this pattern of Filipinos serving in low-ranking positions within the U.S. Navy continued for decades. Then, in the 1930s, we see a significant shift towards large-scale migration driven by economic factors. Filipino workers, drawn by the promise of jobs, began arriving in large numbers, primarily on the West Coast, seeking work in restaurants, hotels, and as domestic help. We're talking about an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 Filipinos coming to the U.S. during this period.
But this influx of Filipino workers triggered a backlash, didn't it?
Yes, unfortunately.
This is where we start to see those familiar anxieties about immigration and job competition play out.
There was a wave of anti-Filipino sentiment, particularly in California, fueled by existing racial prejudices and economic fears. White Americans viewed these Filipino workers as a threat, labeling it the Third Asiatic Invasion, following earlier waves of Chinese and Japanese immigration.
It's a chilling echo of the rhetoric we still hear today, with concepts like replacement theory rearing their ugly heads. It's a reminder that these fears and prejudices are not just relics of the past. They continue to shape our present.
It's crucial to recognize these recurring patterns in history.
Absolutely.
And what makes the Filipino experience even more complex is their unique legal status at the time. Remember, the Philippines was a U.S. territory, which meant Filipinos were classified as nationals.
So they were neither full citizens nor aliens.
Exactly.
It's a strange in-between category that ultimately worked against them.
Exactly. This national status initially allowed Filipinos relatively easy entry into the U.S. But as anti-Filipino sentiment grew, there were efforts to reclassify them as Mongols or Orientals.
Wow.
So they could be excluded under existing immigration laws, like the Chinese Exclusion Act.
It's almost as if they were trying to change the rules of the game midstream to keep Filipinos out. And even when legal maneuvers failed, there was often outright violence against Filipinos.
Sadly, yes.
Lynchings, beatings, and harassment.
These attacks were fueled by a toxic mix of racism, economic anxiety, and a fear of racial mixing. There was a real panic about Filipinos marrying white women, driven by anxieties about miscegenation and the perceived threat to the purity of the white race.
It's a dark chapter in American history. And one that's often overlooked. So how did the U.S. government respond to this? Growing anti-Filipino sentiment. Did they stand up for the rights of Filipinos?
Well, the response was complex and, frankly, quite cynical. Facing mounting pressure to restrict Filipino immigration, the U.S. government came up with a solution.
What's that?
Accelerate Philippine independence.
So the solution to the problem of Filipino migration was to grant the Philippines independence, which would then allow the U.S. to classify Filipinos as aliens subject to immigration quotas.
Precisely. In 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act was passed. It granted the Philippines independence after a 10-year transition period, but also reclassified Filipinos as aliens, effectively paving the way for their exclusion from the U.S.
It seems like Filipinos were caught in political tug of war. The U.S. couldn't decide if it wanted them as colonial subjects or economic competitors.
It was a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Freedom for the Philippines, but at the cost of shutting the door on Filipino immigration to the U.S.
Yeah.
And just as Filipinos were facing this exclusion,
Right.
World War II erupted,
Right.
transforming them yet again this time into allies.
Huh.
It highlights the volatile and often contradictory nature of U.S.-Filipino relations.
It's fascinating and tragic how the fate of Filipinos was so intertwined with these larger geopolitical forces, so much of the idea of benevolent assimilation. What we see is a history marked by exploitation, exclusion, and shifting political agendas.
It's a reminder that we need to look beyond the rhetoric and examine the real lived experiences of those who have been marginalized and oppressed throughout history.
Absolutely. So we've covered this long and complicated history. From the Philippine-American War to the waves of Filipino migration and the backlash that followed.
Right.
What does this all mean?
Yeah.
What lasting impact did this war and the subsequent decades of complex relations have on both countries?
The legacies of this shared history are multifaceted and continue to shape both the U.S. and the Philippines today.
Right.
Professor Raphael's own journey is a testament to this complexity.
He talks about how his generation was encouraged to study in the U.S. and then return to the Philippines to share their knowledge and contribute to the country's development. It's like they were supposed to be agents of progress, spreading American values and expertise.
Yet instead of becoming an agent of empire, Professor Raphael chose to stay in the U.S. and use his knowledge to critique the very system that brought him there.
Wow.
He became a scholar who challenged the dominant narratives about U.S. imperialism and its impact on the Philippines.
It's an example of how education can lead to unexpected outcomes. How exposure to different ideas can spark a critical awakening.
And while the Philippines gained independence, the legacy of U.S. hegemony continues to influence the country in profound ways. The English language, economic ties, and cultural influence all bear the imprint of this historical relationship.
It's almost as if the war and subsequent colonization created a lasting connection, a sort of umbilical cord that continues to tie the two nations together for better or worse.
And there's a certain irony in how this close relationship with the U.S. has in some ways distanced the Philippines from its Asian and Latin American neighbors. The Philippines shares a long history with both regions, yet the enduring influence of the U.S. has created a unique kind of isolation.
It's a reminder that historical relationships can have unintended consequences, shaping national identities and global connections in complex and often unpredictable ways.
It raises the question, how should we understand the legacies of the Philippine-American War today?
That's a great question.
How do we reconcile America's self-image as a beacon of freedom and democracy with its actions in the Philippines? And how do we make sense of the Philippines' own journey as a nation shaped by both resistance and accommodation to colonial powers?
These are complex questions that demand thoughtful reflection.
Absolutely.
And a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths.
And perhaps the most crucial question is, how do we ensure that the voices and experiences of Filipinos, both in the U.S. and the Philippines, are heard and acknowledged? Their stories have often been marginalized or erased from the dominant historical narratives.
It's time to bring those voices to the forefront.
Absolutely.
And recognize the profound impact this shared history continues to have on both countries. It's incredible how much we've uncovered about this often forgotten chapter of history. We've gone from the naming of a nation to a revolution in 3 acts. From the complexities of benevolent assimilation to the lasting impacts of colonialism and migration.
And what makes this deep dive so compelling is that we're not just recounting events. We're exploring how those events continue to resonate today.
Absolutely.
It challenges us to think critically about the narratives we've been told. And to seek out a more nuanced understanding of history.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave you with something to ponder. We've seen how deeply intertwined the histories of the U.S. and the Philippines are. So knowing what we know now, how should we reevaluate the common narratives about both nations?
It's a question that invites us to look beyond simplified versions of the past. How do we reconcile America's image as a champion of freedom with its actions in the Philippines? How do we understand the Philippines' journey, a nation shaped by both resistance and accommodation to colonial powers?
And perhaps even more importantly,
yeah,
how do we acknowledge the lived experiences of Filipinos in both countries, those whose stories have often been silenced or marginalized?
These are not easy questions.
Right.
But they're essential for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of the shared history and its lasting consequences.
I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to continue exploring this fascinating and complex topic.
Right.
I'd encourage you to delve into the works of Professor Raphael.
Yeah.
Seek out primary sources from Filipinos who lived through these events, and challenge yourself to see history not as a simple story,
right,
but as a tapestry woven from multiple perspectives.
Because ultimately, understanding the past is not just about accumulating facts. It's about using those facts to inform our present and create a more just and equitable future.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.